But as Holding has mentioned now, we have now published a deep tech study and made a report which was covered by media, thankfully. And they have, some of the reports were really on point in terms of titles and then the substance. Some were a bit more catchy, if you will, in terms of titles. And I think it could be our sort of Finnish style of giving feedback and being really honest. But I want to say, truly, we say things from the state of optimism. We truly believe that Korea can be the next deep tech global hub, and this can really drive the economic growth driven by innovation for the next 80 years, and that's exactly why we're presenting it today to you. I will not have time, unfortunately, to cover all the details in this report. However, you can take a look at the report at your own pace when you have the time to do so. But this will be a sort of a preview, and I hope this sparks a good discussion amongst you tonight. Before we get into the details, let's look at this chart here. Now I have listed world's 11 largest companies by market cap, so all the public companies that are being traded today. You see companies like Microsoft, Nvidia, Apple, Amazon, so many of the companies that Dr. Chung has mentioned. And the market cap, as you can see, is quite astronomical. And also, if you look at where they come from and where they started, these are truly deep tech companies at core. Now in our report, we define deep tech a bit narrowly, so we don't count the bigger companies that have scaled already. But here, we do still want to show that historically, within their portfolio, they are truly focused on creating the new tech and then really scaling that. On the other hand, we see the Korean companies. Of course, companies like Samsung, SK Hynix, and then LG, Hyundai, Hanwha, the list goes on, and they have done really great things for the Korean economy. But structurally, it's a bit different, right? Microsoft and Nvidia started as really tech companies, and that's what they focus on. But in this regard, now we're focusing on many, many different things. So it's not super tech focused at this point, at least not in one particular tech. And if you compare this list and as well as the market caps with say the American tech companies, for instance, there's quite a bit of a discrepancy between the digits that you see as well. Well, what does that mean for us? Well, Hyundai and Kia could have been Tesla, for instance, right? But the gap is there. So what we need now is, whether it's conglomerates or startups, really driving the economy of Korea with the deep tech focused mind, and understand that tech is what makes our economy more resilient in the future. So let's discuss how we could really change the economy, revamp the tech ecosystem. In order to understand this, we spent about 6 months, and I have to thank my team who has spent hours and hours on this, and we have hand-selected 432 different companies within Korea, and we've also interviewed 18 different experts globally who have provided us with really great comments. So if you're in the room, thank you very much. We have also looked at different sectors, 10 different sectors that are aligned with the government's segmentation of deep tech here. And to summarize the report itself, I want to divide it into 4 different parts. So first is where we are at today. Second, where do we need to go? Third, what do we need to do? How do we pull that off? And lastly, what is the time scope? And by the time when we get to the end line, what will happen and what does it mean for us in the long term? Let's start with where we are today. We are quite insular, I have to say, and that is a kind of statement, but it is true when we look at the entire ecosystem holistically. There's not a lot of foreign capital, foreign sales, and also foreign talent coming into Korea, and things tend to be quite domestically oriented. And we are also quite focused, or many of the startups, I should say, are preferring the domestic IPO instead of going to NASDAQ, for instance. When we look at it, the statistics, 88% of the total deep tech exits were happening in the Korean domestic market, and the rest were M&A and buyouts. So where do we need to go? Of course, the answer is easy. So we're not so global that we need to be global, but how global? I would say we need to be at Singapore level, we need to be at Israel level. So aim really high, try to bring in the global investors and turn the basic science research into the market-ready products and really commercialize. Surprisingly, only 0.1% of the total R&D expenditure now comes from the foreign sources, unlike 10% in Finland and 45% in Israel. I'll show you later. But this is unacceptable. So this needs to go up a lot higher, and we need to understand why it's not at that level and what do we need to do to get to that level. How do we pull it off? Well, we need to all work together. Stakeholders should collaborate. By stakeholders, I mean mainly 3 different entities. So the investors, startups, and government. We have now last year 3.6 trillion Korean won investments. So that's a fairly large sum of money. So how do we really leverage that and make the full use of that is the question that we ought to ask. And lastly, when we become the global deep tech hub, what does that mean, and how do we actually time that? We see that the next 5 years or so will be quite important. The recent article by Jungang covered Jang Sub-shin's comments, and he talks a lot about catching up dynamically. And this is gonna start by catching up to the foreign benchmarks, but it's gonna move beyond catching up. We gotta be the first mover from the fast follower. So we're no longer accused of being, the copy machine and take it and then make it better type of a ideal, but rather becoming really the first one to put the flag on the top of the mountain there. If you look at the quantum, there's only 4 different quantum companies in Korea that's in our list, and 0 nuclear startups with core proprietary technology. So these are the areas where we can do really well. I was working at the Institute for Basic Science for 3.5 years before joining Reddal, and I saw a lot of world-class scientists, both domestically come from Korea and also foreign scientists working here. So we need to really leverage them and then try to do things that other countries cannot at this rate, at this level. So let's start talking about where we are today. Globality lacking is really the main concern here. But before going into statistics, let's talk a bit more about the definition of deep tech that we're using in our study. So it's mainly 3 things. So first, they have to have core proprietary technology that is not easily copied by anyone else. So if say any engineer can copy it with help of generative AI in 1 or 2 weeks, then that's likely not a core proprietary technology that would fit in our category. Secondly, we limit it to the existing small and medium-sized enterprises as well as startups, so the companies that have not scaled yet to the conglomerate level, and also companies that have raised at least a single round of funding, so companies that are not in the stealth mode, if you will. And lastly, we also want to align with the Korean government's selected deep tech segments to avoid confusion. So 10 different segments there, and we have now put them as different buckets here. And as you can see, biotech is about half of the 432 different companies that we have selected. This doesn't necessarily mean that Korea is currently focusing on biotech. What it means is that Korea happens to have pushed for large, really investments into the biotech industry during the past several years, and we have now a lot of biotech companies which happen to fall nicely into the deep tech bucket. But if you look at the other areas, the numbers are quite low. The counts are not at the level we see even in Finland and Estonia and the Nordic countries. Of course, AI and big data has now become a cross-industry trend and is quite pervasive, I would say, across many of these industries. Other than that, even cloud network systems, semiconductor, even though we have great companies like Rebellions and so on and so forth, the counts are quite low. And as mentioned, quantum nuclear basically not existing there. So this poses a big question: what are we doing wrong, and what should we do better? To talk about the trends that's driving these movements within the deep tech ecosystem, let's start with what's sort of the general thing. So government, of course, they understand, and they're smart people, that deep tech is something that can really drive the country's economy for the next generations to come. As when we look at the sector-specific things, they tend to be more global. So tying back to the previous slide that I was showing about AI and biotech, these are the big things. So ChatGPT being introduced in 2022, that really sparked everything. And biotech interests now, having gone through the COVID era with mRNA technology and then gene editing technology now coming about, it becomes a fairly hype sector now. And of course, there's some mandates globally impacting the sustainability initiatives. So if you look at the conglomerates in Korea that's in need of having these drop-in solutions in the foreign markets, then you're going to see a lot of demand coming from those folks as well. If you look at the challenges and inhibitors for the growth, it becomes a bit more local. So talent drain to bigger markets, we see a lot of AI engineers, software engineers in general, moving to bigger markets like the US or UK and Europe even. So that is not a good sign for the Korea's AI market for now. Limited groundbreaking solutions, again, not creating the solutions at the level of ChatGPT. Of course, that's a really tall order, but we haven't seen so far too many companies coming up with really earth-shattering, tantalizing solutions yet. We are quite strong in tech, but weak in market. So this now again goes back to things like quantum and nuclear. We're selling nuclear power plants and reactors to Czech Republic. We're selling maybe to other countries in Eastern and Northern Europe as well, but we don't have any startups in this at all, which is quite surprising. Of course, macroeconomic factors hitting us a bit more than usual. Currency exchange also not being in favor of Korea these days. Slow startup scenes at universities. Seoul National being the only one at 77th of global top 100 universities by startup founders, and the leading universities are like Berkeley, MIT, Stanford. So we need to think about how to get up to that level, and also the limited foreign capital really indicating the lower interest of the foreign investors into this market. To talk briefly about the Korean VC history, I think many of you know much better than I do actually, but the story is that in the 80s we started this, and then now it has become quite robust, I would say. We have gone through the booms and the busts, and we have now closely followed the global sort of boom and bust cycle. And it seems that it might be going into the bust cycle again. So how do we build resilience? We're buzzing, but we're not really buzzing in any clear direction in this regard. For the investors, however, it kind of becomes a confusing situation, especially regarding deep tech, because you see between 30 to 40% of the total investments, VC investments every year, goes into deep tech related sectors per government's report. However, if you look at the outcome of this, you don't see a lot of deep tech on the unicorn list, right? You see a lot of B2C stuff, you see a lot of platform stuff that can be a short return, but deep tech really not out there. We haven't seen the mega cases where it brought huge returns. Now this becomes a bit of a complicated picture, so let me try to break it down for you. On the far left corner here, we see the financials of the typical or the average deep tech company, and the revenue goes up, which seems to be good, but at the same time, the profitability is also an issue. So you might ask, for tech companies, they're going to lose money until whenever they're going to recoup. But for the investors, however, if you're long-term investors especially, then this is something that you need to address at some point, even for the startups as well. For the foundation counts across years, now we see in 2018, the startup foundation was at the peak at 64 per year, and 6-7 years after that now is down really low. So that also causes a concern in terms of the long-term viability of the investment pipeline. Are you going to have enough companies 5 to 10 years down the road to invest in and make your returns? Also, the CEO profiles, 93% of the deep tech CEOs today are male. And we don't have the exact statistics for this yet, but they're also mostly Korean. I would say about 95%. So what what this means is that we're not fully utilizing the entire population. We're not leveraging the technical people, we're not leveraging the commercial people who happen to be women or foreigners. So we do happen to have actually quite a few of them. So having less homogeneous group of people in this ecosystem could be one way to bring in the globality and global presence and connections here. To talk more about challenges, now this is the inbound foreign investment statistics, and there's quite a bit of discrepancy even between the deep tech segments, so not all are equal in this regard. In AI and big data, about 60% of the deep tech companies that we saw have had some form of foreign investment, but when you go down to biotech or robotics, the percentage becomes quite low, below 30%. What does this mean? Well, this could mean that government has been pushing biotech and robotics and sustainability, but are the foreign investors actually interested in it? The market maybe have decided this already, but we just don't know and we don't pay attention to this as much as we should. But also looking at the list of countries that are investing in Korea, it's mostly the US, and many of them are the species and different investors who happen to have Korean origin as well. So do we actually attract a diverse array of investors who happen to be interested in Korea just because of that? That should be the main question that we should be asking as the whole ecosystem. Looking at the exit cases, this is a simple story, busy slide, but 88% of the deep techs have now exited in the past 5 years via domestic IPO. No foreign IPOs or large M&A deals, except for just a few. How does the stock perform after? Well, not so well. After 3 to 6 months, it dropped significantly. Now you might say that it's because of the market hype during 2020 and 2021, which is partially true, but even for the recent years, it hasn't really picked it back up either. So sure, the valuation haircuts came, but in the end, are they really outperforming the average index? Not so much, unfortunately. So let's then talk about where do we need to go? What should be the ambition level for us? How do we become more global, or at what level do we want to be in terms of global presence? And how do we turn the innovation in the basic science sector into the private sector? Before going into the details again here, let me summarize what I will talk about in terms of how to become the deep tech global hub and what are the key gaps that we are seeing in Korea today. First of all, global presence and global connections, whether that be fund, talent, or the customer availability, we need more. Now, we don't have a lot of startups who are truly born global, I would say. Somehow startups think that they can come up with a strong domestic strategy. They can sell to the conglomerates like Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, SK, and then they can retrofit that to go global and then fit the needs of the foreign customers and really sell to them. But often that doesn't really work. You see, the foreign customers often have very different and particular preferences, and the product market fit might not be as good. And it takes half the time finding the right marketing even at the early stage of global sales. So this is a very risky behavior, I would say, and something needs to happen in that regard. Second is the supporting infrastructure. Commercial innovation is really lacking. So as I mentioned, the basic science research is phenomenal in Korea. We have a lot of great scientists, really good citations in really good journals being published all the time, but somehow they don't lead to commercialization. They're not too, unfortunately, interested in making money in this regard, but we need to really motivate them in this regard. Lastly, the policies coming from the government and having a clear sort of a role of what government should be in this system. Unfortunately, today it tends to be quite inconsistent. Every 5 years we elect a new president, and the whole cabinet changes, and there is a new SAR for SMEs and for startups. And in this time of the year, it's actually 3 years, so the frequency has become even more. So how do you, as a startup, navigate that? It's not easy at all. So as as a government, what we suggest them to do is not necessarily force things. Don't try so much on funding and such, but be a supporter and really harmonize the domestic regulations to the global standard regulations so that the companies that are born in Korea can really compete with foreign competitors head to head without having to adjust so drastically in different markets. This is one example of the global presence and global connection when it comes to investments. As mentioned, Korea is at 0.1% when it comes to private sector R&D expenditure coming from foreigners. Israel, 45% comes from foreign sources. Of course, Israel is a bit of a different case, and the way that their economy works is slightly different. But even comparing with other markets, US, UK, Sweden, Finland, you name it, all the markets have significantly higher. I mean, you can just see that 0.1 is just a really low number in general. So this is just to show that how are others performing. When it comes to the R&D conversion also, and then the startup formation, well, first, the R&D expenditure, as Dr. Chung mentioned, we are spending quite a bit of money. 5.2% of GDP goes into R&D expenditure. So a lot even compared to US, Sweden, Belgium, Japan. But when we talk about the knowledge, technology outputs, we're down at 10. When we talk about university, industry, R&D collaborations, the linkage there between those two parties is very weak for different reasons. Now, mostly at the bottom of the OECD list. What we gotta do is bring it up to this level. We have the best human capital and research. We need to be up there, not down here. And that's what we want to achieve in the next 5 years. So how do we do this? How do we pull this off? There's a laundry list of things to do, let me tell you. For startups, there's 3 things. First of all, being global. So take the globally difficult questions and try to tackle them with whatever creative solutions you have. We have the best talent, so use your brains and then try to solve them in the private market, not just in the institution labs. Then second, commercialization strategies, testing them globally. We often understand that many of these founders who are tech-driven want to run the company also, but sometimes you need some support in terms of commercialization. So having the experts on board and really having them help you go global will be the next step. Third, reducing dependence on government subsidies. Government has been great in terms of providing subsidies, fund the funds, many different ways to help the startups, but it can be a little too hectic if you fall in the trap of writing 10 different proposals and having to deal with all the paperwork. For investors, 2 things. So increasing the deep tech competence to distinguish yourself from the other groups and really support the startups. I'll show you the background of many senior associates and the statistics regarding their STEM background, but we do think that they have the right backgrounds. We just have to train them on the jobs and make sure that they can really identify really good companies that can scale globally versus the ones that are not worth the investments. And then also diversifying the LP composition. It's not an easy task, but we do see the necessity in doing so and then bringing in more diverse representation in the Korean VC ecosystem. For government, we carefully say that stepping back might be a good thing. So less can be more in this regard, right? So deregulate either in investment restrictions or portfolio management, or in the testing environments and for the upcoming technologies. So making sure that bleeding edge technologies can be born in Korea, tested in Korea, sold in Korea and elsewhere is really the main thing that we should be thinking about. First of all, let's talk about the startups. So this might be a bit of a controversial picture, but we're showing what are the tiers of different startups, mostly based on how well do they solve the difficult challenges and how global are they and what type of funding are they getting. So if you're at the tier 1, you're getting the attention of the large global VCs and VCs. I think Makina Roxas is here today, so good for you guys. And for tier 2 as well, they're not bad. I mean, they're good also. We're quite strict here. But how do you get up to tier 1 and tier 2 level? Let me tell you in 4 steps. So first, having the non-replicable core technologies, making sure that you're not just creating some AI chatbots with APIs from ChatGPT or Perplexity, whatever it might be. You're actually creating value. You're doing something that no one else can do at the current moment. And having the global presence and leadership in the domain. So really competing head to head with the global competitors, not just the domestic competitors who are next door down on Terra. No. Third, attracts foreign investments, making sure that you have the right connections. It's not just a funding source, by the way. They bring the global connections, they bring the expertise, they bring the experience. So understanding the non-capital value of these foreign VCs, PEs can be quite important as well. Scalability also important thing. So always companies need to make money and financial implications and where they can end up, and that potentially is also quite important. This is to reiterate in a little bit. How does the IPO play in the exit strategy? First of all, even before thinking about do I want to IPO, you should ask, do I want to really exit at this point, right? So you might think that going public, exiting, and making the headlines on ZDNet is gonna solve all the problems that you have, and you're gonna feel great, but that's far from the case. If you look at the statistics here, the median access market return has been quite poor after 6 months. And in some cases, company might have to delist from the market to gain back some control and then to salvage what is left. So in order to not run into that issue, first ask whether do I need to do this, so exercise patience to avoid premature exits, and think about whether IPO is really the right path for you. It could be M&A, it could be buyout, it could be many different things. In Silicon Valley, ChatGPT is not trying to IPO right away. Microsoft or Meta and these companies are buying out companies all the time and investing huge sums of money, but we don't really see that in Korea. We're always hearing about companies wanting to go IPO and selecting which partners they have chosen for that IPO, and it becomes quite repetitive and goes into that unfortunate story. For investors, what do they need to do? As mentioned, they need to really grow the competence. I'm not saying they don't have the competence, but I'm saying that there is not a clear correlation between the existing STEM backgrounds of the current VC associates and then how the portfolios are formed. We have 50% and above of VCs who have some sort of a STEM background, so really leverage that and also learn on the job and try to understand which are the really good companies to invest in. Also, in terms of LP composition, Korea has a fairly focused LP composition. I would say in financial institutions and government agencies with fund of funds especially being quite helpful. We also see some domestic conglomerates and smaller companies and family offices also investing in VC for various reasons, including the tax purposes. But comparing with the United States and UK, not so much of talks about universities and academic institutions, as well as the sovereign wealth funds. So how do we bring those in, and why are they important are the questions that we should be asking. Well, the why is actually quite clear. So things like fund stability, having the flexible capital base, sector experience from these LPs from abroad, of course, having the global network. If you have the money from, say, Saudi sovereign wealth fund, then you're going to be able to go to the region and then excel and then get the context right away. And then if you're engaging, of course, with the government and policy alignment can be a huge benefit there as well. For the government, I said, rethinking what the government role should be. Is that going to be a main regulator, or are they going to be the ones who sort of set the ground and make things happen sort of naturally and spontaneously? I would say the latter is more appropriate in this regard. So investment and portfolio management, it can be quite rigid in some cases, not in all cases. So we reduce that rigidity and be more flexible. This can sound like kind of a general thing, but if you look at the foreign examples like USMA in Israel, BCCI in Canada, and the European Innovation Fund, whether that's just patient capital for a longer period of time or having funds across different funding stages, there's a lot of things that we can do and support without pushing up regulations. In terms of testing, overly conservative and fragmented regulation, especially regarding certain technologies like blockchain and autonomous driving. You don't see, like in San Francisco, for example, in Korea, Waymo cars or autonomous driving taxis driving down the road. You see in some very limited cases, but not at the scale that we see in the foreign countries, especially not outside of Seoul, for example. So these companies like Google, Waymo, the list goes on, they're collecting data already. They're getting way ahead. It's gonna be really hard to catch up. So we gotta avoid that and then make sure that these companies can really innovate on their own timeline and then decide what are the next steps. So one thing that we could consider is negative listing. Negative listing basically means that if you're not prohibiting a certain action, then you're basically allowed to do within the legal boundaries of general law. So if you're not specifically prohibiting, say, autonomous driving, then you can do it. And we see those things in US states like Nevada and Arizona and New York also, and California. And also EU government doing the cross-border harmonization, as I mentioned before, the regulations being not too country-specific unless super necessary, but being more global in that regard as well will be quite important. In terms of how do we pull it off in one timeline, that's a good question. This is how we suggest doing this. So during first phase, really nurturing the startups that can excel in the global stage. So starting with the funding for being selective actually for the export-ready solutions at this point, and then going into phase two, making the major wins with these companies, making sure that these are covered and making sure that they can act as exemplary things that the future startups can look toward and look up to and then innovate even further. And by then, we will have attracted the global talent and the larger investments from global investment firms as well. By phase three, we do think that having all the right elements and having succeeded in all these things, we would have become a global deep tech hub. We're not going to just stay idle and continue to do the same things, but we would have diversified into emerging fields like quantum and nuclear, and that would set us apart from many of the competing countries who cannot do this. And this would need to be a place where everyone, global customers, global investors, global talent come in to play and really innovate. Right. As I mentioned before, I think the Korean economy is really at the crossroads. We can continue to be the way we are. Of course, the SMEs and the conglomerates are doing really great things. We're building the best ships in the world. We're building the best chips in the world. We're building the best cars in the world. But we can take another road. It takes more courage. I'm not saying that we need to let go of LG, Samsung, and Hyundai, but we could have another layer of deep tech companies. We could have companies like Microsoft being born out of Korea. We could have Apple, we could have Meta. These companies, as long as the expectation is high, ambition is high, and we do the right things. So I really hope this can spark some meaningful discussion within the deep tech community. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Andre, for the insightful presentation.